But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, 2 days' worth of wages, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, looking around our sanctuary today, I think we have a number of people in here who have been going to church for a long time. And if that's not you, no problem. But if that is you, would you please do a little experiment with me? Would you please raise your hand if you have ever heard a sermon on the story of the Good Samaritan before? If you've heard us, okay, look around, lots of people. Okay, now please raise your hand if you have ever heard a sermon that covered that just on Mary and Martha. Okay, great. And now raise your hand if you've ever heard a sermon that covered both stories together in one message. Not sure. No confidence. I'm not seeing a lot of confidence in answering that one. Well, I've never heard one either, and I've certainly never preached one, so this will be an adventure for all of us. Now, each of these stories, and hopefully they're both familiar, is so rich with meaning in and of themselves, it's hard to do justice even to one of them in just one message, let alone try to preach on both of them. But Luke was very purposeful in how he arranged the stories in this gospel. And there are things that by looking at the 2 stories together, we might see that we wouldn't notice if we just focused on one at a time. And that is another advantage of using the narrative lectionary, which we've been doing since January. Now, first, we might notice something that I mentioned a few weeks ago, that Luke frequently pairs a story about a man with a story about a woman. And here's another example of that. If you've been reading Luke's gospel at home, you may also have noticed that his gospel includes more women characters than any of the others, and that his is the only one to mention how Jesus and his disciples were financially supported by a number of women who traveled with him, including Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, Susanna, and many more. We won't hear a sermon about that because that was back in chapter 8. You may also have observed that Jesus' ministry has now entered a new stage. So before, he was ministering in and around Galilee. Now, he's on his way to Jerusalem. And the first parable he tells is about someone traveling the same road he himself is about to take. The parable of the Good Samaritan and the story of Mary and Martha have something in common, in that both of them have people who get distracted. In the first story, we hear about a Levite and a priest who are so focused on where they're going, so frightened of what could happen to them if they slow down and stop, that they pass by a Jewish man, one of their own, who is lying half dead in a ditch. The Samaritan man was also going somewhere, but he stopped and took a detour. He got distracted from his business trip by the human need he saw, which Jesus affirms. You could also argue that maybe it's the Levite and the priest who were the ones getting distracted, so intent on reaching their homes they couldn't see the depth of the need in front of them. And then there's poor Martha. So distracted, she actually has a bit of a meltdown. Don't you care, Lord? Tell her to help me, Lord. So distracted that here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about her. Her very name is a legend. So distracted that she is completely unable to savor the experience of having Jesus in her own home. And can't we relate? Those of us who love to host family gatherings at the holidays, but then stress ourselves out with so many preparations that we're too exhausted to fully enjoy ourselves by the time we actually sit down to dinner with our guests. Together, these two stories prompt us to ask ourselves, what is distracting me today? What or who am I missing out on because of my distractions? What opportunities am I passing by because I'm too scared to slow down and stop? Would I even recognize them if I saw them? Jesus says to Martha, few things are needed, in fact, only one. Mary chose the better part, Jesus says. What kind of choices are we making today with our time, energy, attention, and resources? Where are our choices leading us? Towards a meltdown or the feet of Jesus? Another thing we see when we put these two stories together is the way Jesus seems to have this real big soft spot for people who follow their hearts even when it makes the people around them feel uncomfortable. People who dive into the messiness and inconvenience and expense of ministry. The Samaritan stopped to help a Jewish man, a man who would have avoided him if they had been passing each other on the road, because that is how deep the animosity was between Jews and Samaritans. We see it today in the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. The Samaritan risks his own safety in stopping to help. He doesn't know where those bandits went, when they might come back. His business trip is delayed. He's out at least 2 days' worth of wages, probably more. Even if he's well off, that's a big commitment. And then there's Mary. Mary is someone who models what Neil Weatherhog was talking about in his sermon last week. She wants to listen to Jesus. In choosing to sit at Jesus' feet, Mary does something shocking for her time. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright explains that sitting at a teacher's feet is what serious students did. You did not sit at the feet of a teacher unless you planned on becoming a teacher yourself. And that was not an option that was available to women back then. The biggest problem with Mary's behavior, far more than her failure to step up and help her sister, is that Mary is acting like a man. And don't we still feel uncomfortable today when women don't act like women and men don't act like men? I think of myself as open-minded and adventurous. But when I was at the Kansas City International Airport recently, I had to use the restroom. And I forgot that all the restrooms in the new terminal are now all gender bathrooms. And just for a few seconds, I had a little bit of discomfort with that, especially when I entered a stall that a man was coming out of and I had to lower the toilet seat. Men's and women's restrooms have just been my reality for my whole life. Now, I grew up with a brother. I know how to share, but in a public space, that's just not what I've experienced. Well, in Jesus' day, men and women didn't just have separate restrooms. Everything was separate. Men and women worshiped separately, socialized separately, worked separately, ate separately. They were apples and oranges, even more so than the Samaritans and the Jews. So as Mary sits at Jesus' feet, she knows she is bucking convention. She knows she is disappointing her sister. She knows that more than a few eyebrows in that room are raised, more than a few mouths are hanging open just a little bit. It is a messy choice. It is a costly choice. She makes it anyway, and Jesus blesses her for it. A third insight we might find as we look at the two stories together is in looking at the parallels between the lawyer who questions Jesus. You got to watch out for those lawyers. And Martha. Now, the lawyer wants to confront Jesus and expose any problematic views Jesus might have about eternal life. Who gets it and who doesn't? He wants to get Jesus to come out and say who specifically counts as a neighbor and who does not. Instead, Jesus brilliantly turns the tables on him and completely redefines the question from who is a neighbor to how a neighbor behaves, so that the lawyer himself is the one who is forced to admit in the end that the hated Samaritan is the true neighbor in the story, and therefore someone he, the lawyer, is commanded to love. Ooh, Jesus, you are smooth. Martha approaches Jesus, absolutely sure she is in the right. Because what could be more unfair than her sister acting like a man, arrogantly claiming the role of disciple for herself, and leaving Martha with all the tasks? Jesus was famous for helping people. Surely Jesus would help Martha get her sister in line. Instead, Jesus uses this as an opportunity to get Martha straightened out. When we come to Jesus with an agenda, watch out. It's not going to go well. We probably will not get the response we're looking for. Jesus simply does not seem to care about helping us win arguments. or look good or make our family members behave the way we think they should. Jesus cares about our hearts. He cares about the way we see others. He cares about how we treat them. He cares about how exhausted and busy and anxious and distracted we are. As we continue our journey through Lent and through Luke's gospel, may these two stories continue to speak to us together. May we discover our distractions and name them and let them go. May we follow our hearts. May we truly come to Jesus, and may we be touched and transformed, that we too might be neighbors who stop and disciples who sit at Jesus' feet.